Hi everyone, I am Cathy Pham, and I get the privilege today of talking to you about integrating ethics and responsibility in the engineering and product development cycle, a topic that is very dear to me. So, what is the builder's role in technology? What does that look like? So here are a few technologies that have gone awry, and then I'll bring that back to what the builder's role is. We have technologies where facial recognition software didn't recognize Black faces, but did recognize a white face, and Joy Buolamwini has a ton of amazing research around that. We have Google search, which identified certain faces as animals. We have government buying technologies that determine if someone should stay incarcerated or they can go home. And those same technologies over-indexed for different populations of people. And they let more people who have a white background go than more people with a Black background. We have people who are building technologies for social media and ad services who allow you to select a field called ethnic affinity. That is not by choice, but it's a field that the company determines for you based on your profile in that company. And then that field is now used to sell ads. So you can go buy an ad and target a different target whichever demographic you choose to target. And that's not okay, right? For many, but being able to tie that not being okay to the developer or product person building that feature doesn't always exist. So what does that look like? How do we get there? We have cases where now we know, like there's a whole book written about IBM and its role in the Holocaust. So what does it look like when you're selling to a government entity and that government entity is using your technology to store information about people and using that information to cause harm? What does it look like when people are trying to sign up for unemployment benefits during a pandemic and they'll go hungry or can't support their families because they don't have that funding, and your website to sign up for that fails? What does it look like when you're a social media platform, you're allowing people to spread information about hatred online that then leads to genocide of a whole entire population? What does that look like? Which part? Like some of that is policy, some of that is company culture, but some of that is the on-the-ground development and product team trying to figure out what to do in a timely manner and figuring that out. And then there's the issue of, how we have technologies that build for just half the population. We have cases of car test dummies, right, that are built for a typical male body here in the United States. That's very specific. So if you're not a typical male body here in the United States, you could be a female body, you can be a smaller male body, you can be someone from a different region of the world. Cars are just then not as safe for you. We have scenarios where, phones were built for the typical male hand. So for a while, some people couldn't take photos a certain way one-handed because it was too hard. We have cases where, face shields and PPE equipment during a pandemic were also built for a certain population. And so what does that look like? How do we change the individual's role so that we don't end up with a product down the line that only works for half the population? We have scenarios that we know of now where, I think this is so important to think about in this one case, where doctors and nurses and providers were so used to clicking cancel on all the alerts they were getting that when, real drug-to-drug interactions or real overdose scenarios actually came up, they just clicked them away. So if you're on a development team, you're thinking about that. How do you design alerts in a way where you don't lead to ultimately someone's death or someone's severe illness because your technology just completely failed? What does that look like for you as an individual person? What if you're building a COVID vaccine website and people can't sign up for vaccines on time, or people of a certain population have no access to sign up for vaccines? What does that look like? So what are some of the levers for responsible tech? Now that we've went through the gamut of social media companies, selling to governments, physical products, artificial intelligence products, kind of things that might be AI, things that are not, what are all the levers? There's leadership mandate, right? Maybe we're in a company that says we're going to be a more responsible company now. Maybe you're in a company that has different, will rethink its values. Maybe product market value, market fit is something that's really a driver for your product. Maybe you're going to have ethics committees, or maybe you have more review boards or internal policies and regulations. All those things have to happen too. But what I want to talk about today is this last one, which is a product and engineering lifecycle. So even with all these other aspects, unless we change your product development lifecycle, things aren't going to change because the hands on the keyboard are still going to build things that might be problematic. So what are the parts of the different product development lifecycle? There's design, sprints, metrics, user experience research, community perspectives, accessibility, stakeholders, scaling, testing, red teaming, implementation, disaster response, postmortems, maintaining. All these things, right? These are all parts. If you're ever on a team that builds products and services, or an engineering team, you probably have heard these words before. So let's say you think about sprints, for example. Say you have 2-week sprints. What are some of those conversations you have during a sprint? And those every morning, 15-minute stand-ups. Are we raising issues about harm? Are we raising issues about unintended consequences? We don't have to wait till the end of the product to question, right? Are we raising issues every single day? And what does that look like? What does that look like as one of your main metrics? What even are your metrics? Are you only tracking the number of users? Are you only tracking the number of visits? Are those the most important metrics? But what about the ways in which someone uses your product? Or what about the ways, what are some of the users who never use your products or are impacted? What does that look like? What do you consider success? Completely rethinking what metrics are. User experience research. Even some of the best, biggest tech companies in there that are deemed as being the best user experience research teams in the world sometimes also have blind spots and leave out whole communities when they think about user experience research, if they even prioritize user experience research at all. And not just who are our users, but who are the people who might never use your service or product? Who are the people who might never use that social media platform? Who are the people who might never use that policing software, because that policing software was built for law enforcement, but then are deeply affected by the effects of those, like that policing software? They also need to be brought into that research, right? What are some of the community perspectives? What are the missing community perspectives, similar to how you do user experience research? What are the people who are missing from the table? Accessibility, stakeholders, thinking about accessibility, both from the physical abilities, but also accessibility with internet access or any kind of ways to access the system. Who are your stakeholders? Not just the people who are paying you, but all the people who are affected by the system. And when you think about scaling too, maybe a product is fine on a small scale. The internet might have been fine when it was in a much smaller scale. But when the internet and technology became incredibly fast and pervasive and accessible to many more people, there are a ton of more issues we have to grapple with now, right? Testing. How do we think about testing? How do we think about red teaming? Red teaming is a concept that is often used in security to think about vulnerabilities. But what do we think about, what if we now use the red teaming concept? And there are a lot of people thinking about this right now too, and social issues and unintended consequences and ways people use your product, and not just ways people might exploit your security. And thinking about implementation, disaster response, and postmortems, and maintaining, right? So if a disaster happens with in your product, or there's a disaster response in the, like, if this world is experiencing a disaster, what is your product's role? So back in 2020, when there was the big pandemic, what was the role of like online platforms now, of services like Zoom and other video conferencing services that now, your target audience is also 4-year-olds and people who are who normally use something like video conferencing. So what does that look like in a disaster response? Or what if your technology is finding people during a flood or hurricane? There's a ton of ethical implications there too, on how your product is used, and how you think about postmortems and maintaining your service. So after you build a product, what are some of the things that have gone wrong, and how you document those things beyond the quote technical aspects? What are all the things that went wrong, and how people use your product? How people maybe use something for spreading false information in addition to just only sharing cat photos. Maybe your platform was only meant for sharing cat photos, and now people are using for all sorts of other things. So what are all these questions that we have to capture? But think about it in every single one of these little aspects of your product development cycle, and not just at the end. And how do we have people in the room to help us think through that? So let's go through a few cases and to hone into some of those concepts. So to the point of thinking about honor and expertise, I'll share a Google Street View for safety scenario where there was a team that I was on that wanted to think about, let's use Google Street View to determine a safety score. They were so excited about using machine learning algorithm to determine a safety score using Google Street View. Some of you might think that's great. Others of you who think about the history of race, the history of discrimination, etc., might say, I think that might be an issue. Have you heard of the broken windows theory, which has determined that broken windows in a neighborhood will not determine the safety of a neighborhood? And then I think what a really powerful point was an amazing lawyer, Jasmine McNeely, brought up, well, safety for whom? And that caused the whole room to pause, and they thought, oh, I hadn't thought of safety for whom. So you can have the best algorithm and a safety score, but I might feel safe in a neighborhood that you might feel really unsafe in, and vice versa. So even safety for whom? And that completely turned that whole product on its head. There's a case of Airbnb discrimination where they brought in Laura Murphy from the ACLU, and it really gets to the point of what happens when you embed decision making in the product engineering team and inside the product and engineering development cycle. So instead of, a lot of times these consultants are put on policy teams somewhere, Airbnb brought this deeply knowledgeable person into the product team, which is both the source of power for many tech companies, but also where a lot of decisions get made. And they had stuff that come up, like non-discrimination policies and unconscious bias training. But I think a few of the things I thought were so critical for the product team was guest pictures were no longer displayed in the reservation request. And then about 70% of over 6 million accommodations were now allowed to be instant booking. And that's something where likely an engineering team alone will not think of how guest pictures and instant booking, those features alone, can lead to cases of discrimination or not. And having this person deeply embedded in the product team allowed them to make that connection of, oh, if you can book more instantly, that also narrows down the time that someone could be discriminated against. So let's talk about forms. And one last case I'll think about is bringing it down to a really detailed level of writing code, right? You might just be an engineer on a team, but when you decide that you're going to make a gender a Boolean, you're now also making the decision that in your product, a gender can be one or the other. And not have a choice of different options. You might have decided that you may not translate or do localization in a product, and that alone, right? Like if you're building, let's say, an information page for COVID vaccine information, what happens when that's not localized or translated properly? What happens when you have required address fields? It's a very quick fix in the code to make something required or not. But then someone who is unhoused might not have an address field and they now can't sign up for your service. Or what if you replicate a paper-based service, like let's say a survey on the history of incarceration in your family, and you bring that survey into an online product. Now you're just propagating problems with that survey that is fraught with issues of the history of incarceration in someone's family. So how do we think about all these issues? And these are some of the cases that come up when we don't, and we just replicate some of the issues that we see in real life. So I'll end with powers exist with the builders. We've talked about how individual builders, in addition to, policy, leadership mandates, values are so important. I find that this picture really brings it home for me, where we can design a perfect car all day and have the beautiful, ideal car of, let's have like the perfect car that drives wonderfully. Similarly to tech, where you're going to have this wonderful algorithm that will never be biased. But the people who are putting the car together, where you put the steering wheel, where you put the tires, where you put the doors, how you put on the handles, all those little details, when they don't come together the right way, it doesn't matter if you've designed it perfectly. The implementation of it's going to make it for a car that doesn't drive well or hurt someone. And it's similar with tech, right? So taking that car analogy over to software, even everything from the types of programming language you decide on. So JavaScript, Python, Java, all of those alone can also lead to downstream ethical considerations. Will you have a spam filter and what that looks like, and what even is spam? What if you declare something that's spam that's actually really valuable information? And like, where are you storing all your data and all your information? All those decisions along the way, again, you can have high level great design, but if you're not executing it well, if you're not storing it in a data center that is safe or secure, if you're picking a language that has tendencies that are can be exploited, but you don't think about those issues, what are all these decisions you're making? And it's really critical to think of the right decision. So a few resources, if you haven't seen it, the Equity by Design framework, the Ethical OS, a ton of books ranging from Safiya Noble's Algorithms of Oppression, Race After Technology by Dr. Ruha Benjamin, Geek Heresy by Kentaro Toyama, Cathy O'Neill's Weapons of Math Destruction, Artificial Intelligence, and so many more books out now to really help us think about some of the issues of the products that we build. And there's a wonderful framework called Design Ethically, put out by Kat Zhao, to help us also think about some of the considerations of our products. So where do we go, or what do we do, and where do we go? Everywhere. As I mentioned, right? It's not just one sector or one area. It could be government, startups, industry, enterprise tech, consumer tech, policy, the general internet space, academia, venture capital, consulting. We need a shift in the product development and engineering development cycle in all of these places. It's not just one area that needs our help. So it takes all of us to change things, and hopefully you'll all go and shift how we think about product and design everywhere.